Okay, welcome everybody and good morning. For many of you, this is going to be your first session at ORFC this year. So we're really happy to be kind of kicking it off for you. And for others, maybe you checked out some sessions yesterday. Today we're going to be focusing on Herbal Leys, and as the title says, looking at some of the technical details around establishing them and managing them, but also look at some of the current research and lived practices of farmers working with Herbal Leys as well. My name's Ed. I work at a centre for farming and food education in the Cotswolds called Farm Ed. That really has nothing to do with my name. It stands for education. And we're joined today on the panel by Ian Wilkinson, founder of Farm Ed. We also have Paul Totterdell, who's general manager of Cotswold Seeds, who are a supplier of Herbal Ley seed mixes. Dr. Lydia Smith, who's head of Innovation Farm and the Innovation Hub at NIAB, who's going to be speaking about the kind of benefits of Herbal Leys to the crops that follow them and kind of thinking beyond Herbal Leys in the system. And also Jonty Brunyee, who's head of sustainable farming and food at Farm Ed. And in his spare time, what little spare time he has, is also an agroecological tenant farmer in the Cotswolds and has been using Herbal Leys for a number of years. He's going to share his practices. So we'll jump into each of the sessions, each of the presentations shortly, and we'll have a little bit of time at the end, or a good chunk of time actually at the end for questions and answers. So for anyone who's not been on these sessions before, there is a Q&A button to use at the bottom of the Zoom window. And the preference is if you can put your questions into that section, it's easier for me to find them and I can direct them to the right panelists. Rather than putting them into the chat. The chat might get a bit busy and we'll lose track of those questions. So send them through and I'll do my best to try and get them answered throughout the day. But without further ado, I'll hand over to Ian to start us off. And Ian's going to be sharing with us the general kind of benefits of Herbal Leys and speaking a little bit about the experience of our Herbal Ley system as a demonstration at Farm Ed as well.
Thanks very much, Ed. Very good morning to you all. I'm hoping that I'll be able to share my screen with you. Okay, I think we're good to go. So my job is to set the scene this morning. So I'm going to give you a rough guide in 10 minutes to Herbal Leys. As you know, I've been involved in this field of work for some time. I'm really pleased to see that it's getting so much more interest these days, mainly from farmers, of course, but also now from policy. So really interesting to be in this session. Thank you very much indeed. The Herbal Ley mixture is just that. It's a mixture of grasses, clovers, and herbs. And without all of those components, it simply doesn't work. So this is a very different approach to the sort of monoculture approach that people would be used to. The mixtures of grasses that's commonly used, ryegrass, cocksfoot, timothy, meadow fescue, these are the sort of plants that people would typically put in. There are plenty of other species available, as you know, but these are the four main agricultural ones that people use. There are loads of legumes to choose from. These are the typical ones. Typical clovers, that we all know the true clovers, red and white clover, but there's loads of others. Sandfoins, lucernes, vetches, trefoils, you name it, they're all in there somewhere. And I think it's really interesting that the best results seem to come from those mixtures that have highly diverse, very, very different types of plants. Those are the ones that give the best performance with Herbal Leys. And finally, the final group is herbs. And of course, these haven't been commonly used, not in my lifetime, but previously within agriculture, forage herbs were used across the board and they were extremely common. So it's just our generation that skipped a beat on this. So I'll tell you a little bit more about them as we go through. Where they're used, well, principally they're used on livestock farms, of course, as temporary grass. These are temporary leys that last for 3, 4, 5 years. They can last longer, and some people will put them down for longer. But what I'm talking about specifically this morning is how they fit into a rotation. So if they're in a rotation to build fertility and improve soil and feed livestock, then they're there for 3 to 5 years. They will work very well in arable systems with livestock or without, and also horticultural systems. So they are a good all-rounder, and they're ideal for the UK climate, of course, this temperate climate, beautiful temperate climate that we have. The good news is for grazing, and that's what they're nearly always used for on livestock farms, It is the cheapest form of forage because it contains everything: high protein, lots of healthy plants, and lots of forage all year round. The main reason I've been interested in them for most of my working time is because they improve the soil. They literally regenerate the soil. And now, 10, 20, 30 years on through the time I've worked, for the last 10 years or so, they've also been thought of as a planet cooling solution. And this concept of more than just monoculture, in other words, lots of different species together, is definitely one source of improving soils and sequestering carbon, no question at all. Very different approach to the monoculture approach. And I fully understand and have been involved with monoculture for so many years, but it is heavily dependent on greenhouse gas emitting products for the production. In other words, lots of nitrogen fertilizer. And, you know, we all know very well that these costs have increased dramatically. But if we're to utilize leys that contain other species, there's no point at all putting a little bit in. We need a lot of diversity and a good representation of each type of diversity. That means a sward should have perhaps 30% clover, 30% herbs, and perhaps 30% grasses, not 90% grass with a little bit of clover. It doesn't work in the same way. I think for me, what's been really interesting is that there isn't a revolution required in this sector. We already know these things work. We just have to reintroduce them into the system. These are hundreds of years old. Farmers, many of them you will know from your history lessons, have used this approach for fertility building without the need for fertilizers and expensive inputs. And expensive inputs they are. This is a chart I put together a few years ago. One or two of you may have seen this one before. And when I put the nitrogen fertilizer prices on here, gradually over every 5 years or so, they were increasing, doubling. Well, you know, this year, you know, with the problems we've had with gas supply and the markets for gas, that fertilizer price has more than doubled. You know, ammonium nitrate today would be £600 to £700 a ton. You know, these are seriously expensive products now to use. What's the alternative? Well, to me, it's always been an obvious alternative to look at legumes. Well, it certainly is now, if only for economic reasons. But there's other reasons to use it too. You can use this approach to grow your animals in a healthy way. Many of the plants we use are extremely healthy in terms of the fodder that they provide to ruminant animals. Through the Legume Plus research project, which Lydia, Paul and I have been involved with for many years, we were able to unravel some of the mysteries behind some of these wonderful plants like sandfoins and birdsfoot trefoil and red clover, to understand the properties, these magical properties that they have in terms of animal health. And it's fair to say that when these are included in diets of ruminant animals, the animals need simply less veterinary and medicine interventions. As far as bloat is concerned, it's not something you see when your swards are rich in clover, provided there are lots of bloat-free plants. So sandfoin, as an example, will offset the risk of bloat if it's in the mixture. And this is a really important point when we're thinking of feeding cattle in particular. As far as weeds are concerned, I know we're going to be talking about weeds later on, but the one thing that I've noticed over the years, and certainly here at this farm where I am, we don't get an invasion of weeds. Of course, we get annual weeds when we sow any ley, bound to, but the animals graze them out. And then because these swards are so competitive, you simply just don't get a burden of weeds. So there's no need for herbicides. Even if there was a need for herbicide, we can't use them, remember, because of course these are very complex mixtures, often with 17, 18 species in. We can't use selective herbicides on these crops. Worms will love these. We've got lots of examples here on this farm. We have conventional wheat on this farm growing. If you dig a spade of soil, you'd be lucky to see a worm. This is fertilized, conventionally grown. If we go to our heritage wheat, which is in the rotation with the Herbal Leys, we might see 5 or 6 worms per spadeful. But if you go to the Herbal Leys, where we're building the fertility for 4 years in our 8-year rotation, you might see 15 or 16. And Danielle Semple, who's an intern here, has been showing me this work over this winter. And it's fascinating. You know, it's such an easy thing to monitor. Dig it up, have a look, you'll see for yourselves. Of course, the main reason that people, farmers in particular, are interested in Herbal Leys is because they're resilient. They provide forage when other crops stop growing. And where we are on dry ground here, particularly in the summers, you get nothing from a single species monoculture grass. but you do get production from deep rooting herbs and production from deep rooting legumes. And when it rains, which it inevitably does at the end of a drought, the grasses are the first to race back. So the ryegrass and things that do nothing in the dry weather come back very quickly indeed. So it's really important to have that balance of varying species. When it's really wet, as it's been, we've seen lots of water falling on this farm like everyone else. And I'm in the beautiful Evenlode Valley, where the river Evenlode goes to 15 million people I can see down from our valley into London. And those 15 million people get the water from this farm, and all of the tens of thousands of farms around in the same thing. We need to get the water to stay on the farms where it falls and not run off straight into the valley, flooding people downstream. We know it's an important role that we play within agriculture. It's a 3-season ley. These plants, the grasses, clovers and herbs, they grow at different times of the year, which is what gives us that ability to have long grazing periods and resilient forage production. And because of the herbal content, we can provide minerals in our animals' diet and subsequently in our own diet when we grow these mixtures in our leys. Of course, grasses and things don't access minerals in the same way that herbs do. And by having growth, which then is returned to the soil, whether it's through animals or through toppers, we will get a higher mineral content in our diet when we eat the wheats or whatever follows, or the dairy products, that whatever we take from our farming systems. Pollination, of course, is also another service that these legumes provide. And this is the easy way to do it. You know, lots of flowering species, which you get with Herbal Leys, and that's really good. As we know, it's a wonderful crop in terms of wildlife. Wildlife delivery is amazing with these, and this is great and really super important, especially with so many monocultures around the world, because the other alternative is this. And seriously, you know, we know these images exist. We know this is happening in Asia, where there are no pollinators, and this is one option. Maybe drones might be another option. There was a piece in the New Scientist, I think, some years ago about using drones for pollination. But for me, I think the simple way is just to have a habitat and food for bees. Yield-wise, we know what monoculture grasses do. We know what monoculture species do generally. But it's when we start to add grasses and legumes and clovers together with herbs that we begin to see a really amazing effect, a truly astonishing, free, amazing effect. It's an over-yielding effect. We can get more yield, whether we're fertilizing or not, by combining 3 distinctly different plant species together. And this is the over-yielding effect that Darwin noticed in the origin of species, which I've often referred to. But this has been proven time and time again by many scientists. Darwin was the first. We've had lots of wonderful work since. There's some great farmers, and I'll just finish with these, who have been using Herbal Leys for many, many years, who I've known for a long period of time. Rob Richmond, who farms here on very dry ground in the Cotswolds, has had best part of 2 decades of growing Herbal Leys with great success for dairy cows. Ian Boyd is another farmer I know well, who's a good ambassador for pasture-fed beef, and is using Herbal Leys with his effectively his GS4, his organic version of OP4, and is doing a wonderful job of rebuilding soils. And Charles Hunter Smart, finally, who's on a big scale with highly diverse leys. And Charles, I spoke to only yesterday, and he is an advocate of these leys for many reasons on dry land and on heavy, but mainly for animal health. And you can see that his animals are particularly healthy, and the worm burdens in his sheep, for example, are incredibly low. And he's very pleased with them. So I think probably on that, I'll just finish with a very quick recap. We have a demonstration Herbal Ley system here on the farm at Farm Ed. We run training courses. We have a sheep system here with a micro dairy too. And it's an interesting experience to come and see it. Everyone is very welcome all the time. But that's it. Thank you. I think my time is up. I know Ed will be chasing my tail unless I finish now. Thank you.
Wonderfully timed. Thank you very much, Ian. And yeah, just a really great intro to Herbal Leys and really defining what it is we're talking about, because there's certainly some confusion sometimes around what exactly a ley is, and also what this kind of herbal inclusion is. Just a couple of questions have come in on the chat, maybe just to ask them while Paul sets up, specifically around the kind of winter seasons. Can you speak to Farm Ed's experience of how we're managing the leys over winter, kind of last point of grazing, and what kind of state do we leave the leys in during the winter months? Are they kind of grazed down or some residuals?
Sure. So obviously we want to make sure that we're not leaving bare soil over the winter. And as tempting as it is, because we get wonderful regrowth going into the winter, we take the animals off from this system in October. And there is grass there now. I just walked across it this morning, actually, and there's loads, just hundreds of birds coming over the Herbal Leys at the moment, taking seed off the stems. And it's really interesting because we could graze it, we could top it, but actually I see a huge wildlife benefit in leaving those Herbal Leys. I see a huge benefit in terms of soil building by not grazing them over the winter. If we protect them now, we'll get very good early spring growth on this farm in April. We're quite high, well, relatively high up here. It's a cold farm. And we need to protect the leys. We've got a lot of pasture around. We have sandfoin that we go on to graze. We went on to graze the aftermath on the sandfoin in November. We've got sheep at the moment in our orchard on permanent pasture, and so we move them around the farm, Ed. So yeah, we don't overgraze. Really important. I have made the mistake here over the years. We've been running this system now for 8 years of overgrazing. And that's a big problem. We shouldn't be overgrazing any leys going into the winter.
Brilliant, thanks. And hopefully that answers, I think it was Matthew Jordan's question and another question in the chat as well. So that was great. Brilliant. Okay, well, I'll hand over to Paul now from Cotswold Seeds, who's going to talk a little bit more in detail around the kind of technicalities of setting up these systems and managing them, and I think also diving into what species we're talking about and why you might select certain ones given your context as well.
Brilliant, thank you, Ed, and thanks to everyone for having us here. It's lovely to be here and be presenting today. So I'm just sort of going to follow on a little bit with some establishment and management information about Herbal Leys. I've been working with Herbal Leys for about 20 years now, and it's great to be finally talking about this to a larger audience. I'm going to select a select few items. So I've got about 5 items I'm going to touch on. Appreciate there'll be other questions we can touch on in the Q&A a little bit later on. But I've put up here to begin with a little checklist, and Ian's covered a lot of these in his talk. And it's quite a considerable list. It's quite a long list, isn't it? And I think the question we have to ask ourselves, and Ian's already alluded to this, is can a single species provide everything? Can it provide all of these lovely benefits that we're looking for from our grassland? And I think the obvious answer is no. I mean, I think certainly there are some species which can offer some of these, but I think to get the diversity in is really, really important. And for it to be a true herbal ley, it needs to be more diverse, I think, than just simply a couple of grasses, a couple of legumes, and a couple of herbs. We're looking for, as Ian was mentioning, the highest level of diversity that we can. So when we're taking into account how to put these mixtures together, and we're trying to benefit from all of these different characteristics, there are other things that we need to take into account. So I've listed out here some of the thought processes that we have to go through when we're developing these Herbal Ley mixtures. So an obvious one is seed size. If you've ever looked at a bag of Herbal Ley seeds, or any seeds for that matter, you'll know that they vary in size quite a bit. And that being the case, you have to take that into account when you're balancing the mixture. And I think the establishment and management of Herbal Leys almost always comes back to the challenge of maintaining the level of diversity in the sward as best we can. So all of the things I'm going to speak about over the next few minutes are associated, and they come back to that factor. So when we're trying to make sure we have the right amount of the right species in the bag, which is dependent on all of these factors here, such as your own personal climate, the soil type, the vigor of the species that we're including, we have to very carefully balance all of these species. And this has taken a lot of time, a lot of experience to get to this stage where we are confident in doing this now. And we have various different Herbal Leys being used by various different farming systems, and very successfully. You'll see one of the items at the bottom of the list there is preference. And I think this is a really important one. A lot of the information that is passed down through the generations and through the farming fraternity is really important information. And a lot of it isn't scientific and it's anecdotal, but it's important information, and it's there for a reason. There's no smoke without fire. So, preference is an important one as well. We all have our different preferences. So going on to, I can see some of the questions were about the practicalities of sowing Herbal Leys and what you can and can't do. And I'm sure there'll be some more later on. But the seedbed preparation and before we even get to the sowing of the seed is really, really important, particularly for Herbal Leys. So these sorts of seeds are very, very small. They therefore don't need to be buried very deeply. They only need to be very shallow in the soil profile. And when I say shallow, I mean really shallow. We're talking in the top ½ inch, top sort of 10 millimeters or so of soil. And in order to achieve that, we really need to create a decent seedbed. Now, mostly Herbal Leys are established from a clean seedbed, because this is the most successful way to do it. You can overseed into existing grasses, which I saw was one of the questions earlier on, and we'll touch on that in a moment. But primarily, the best way to establish a Herbal Ley is from scratch on bare soil, as we see here. The picture on the left is a really nice one. It's showing a rolling process. And this shows a really nice, fine, flat and firm seedbed. The particular soil that we're looking at here is quite stony Cotswold brash, but we still managed to get it pretty flat and pretty fine. And these 3 Fs, fine, flat and firm, are really, really important to make sure that these seeds don't trickle down and get too deeply into the soil profile. And you can see also there that it's been rolled pretty well, but we'll touch on that in a moment. Seedbed preparation regarding ploughing, you can plough obviously, but the less that we disturb the soil, the better. I appreciate there's lots of no-till or low-till systems out there. On our own Herbal Ley, we use a shallow plough to destroy the previous crop, but appreciate that if you can achieve damaging the existing ley as much as possible from the surface, then that can also be a perfectly suitable method. You might use a power harrow, you might use various other mechanical equipment from the surface, such as discs and so on. And it is possible to establish a Herbal Ley by doing that. So we've established that we need a fine and firm seedbed. Now, what do we use to plant the seed with? Now, it's another really, really common question. I think the answer is that you can use, the kit that you've got on the farm is most likely going to be absolutely fine. It's not what the kit you've got, it's the way that you use it. And I think there are all sorts of methods, all the way from very, very complex, very, very technologically advanced drills, all the way down to the really, really basic kit, something as simple as a slug pelleter and a little roller for just broadcasting the seed onto the surface. If you are using bigger equipment, particularly if you are bringing contractors in to do these sorts of plantings, it's really, really important to pay attention to the depth that the seeds are being sown. Really, really important. It's actually quite common for contractors to come in, not have a great deal of experience with smaller seeds, and the seeds end up getting buried too deeply, and then that has adverse effects on establishment. And some species won't grow at all if you get them beyond that sort of ½ inch. So the money that we're spending on these Herbal Leys, we want to make sure that we're getting the absolute maximum we can from all the different species. So again, that shallow sowing is really important. But I think because all of the methods that are used require the seed to be sown really shallow, one of the really important processes is to roll, roll and roll again. If the seeds are near the surface, you want to push the seeds and the soil together. You want to consolidate that seed bed really, really well. And the only way to do that is really to roll. Some people can use stock in overseeding situations. You can put animals back onto the ground after you've sown the seed. That helps to tread it in for you. And you can skip this process. But the consolidation process, by whatever means, is really important. A lot of people will be familiar with the headlands coming really, really well. And much quicker than the main field when you're planting smaller seeds. And almost always the reasoning for this is the fact that they get driven on and turned on. So the consolidation is really good. And therefore, the seeds get their moisture from the soil. And so if they're not in really good contact with the soil, then they can't get that moisture. And so it's really, really important part of the process. So timing is a really, really important one as well. And I think generally of late, it feels like the seasons are getting later. So it feels like it takes longer for it to warm up in the spring, and it feels like it takes longer to get colder in the autumn. However, we've got to be really, really careful not to try and plant very, very temperature sensitive herbs and legumes into cold soil. Even if it feels the right temperature at that moment, it's not so much about the temperature at the time of planting. It's as much to do with the temperature over the coming few weeks and months, which are really, really important. Just like human beings, if you get a good start, likelihood is you'll be better off later on. And it really does work like that with plants as well. So what we say is particularly in spring planting, I know spring can be difficult, it can be cold and dry for a long time, but it is worth waiting. We're talking, I would say, mid to late April before you even consider planting these seeds. If you try and plant a herbal ley sooner than this, my colleagues always laugh and joke at me because I always talk about the April snowfall. There always is one, and I prefer to get that out of the way and done with before we start planting seed. Because if the temperature is still fluctuating like that, chances are the herbal ley is going to have a hard job of establishing. So I would stick to, as best you can, mid to late April, even into May. We've planted in June before. It's all about the conditions at the time. You're looking for 7 or 8 degrees and on the rise in the soil. So this is soil temperature, 7 or 8 degrees and on the rise. We use soil temperature because it's steadier and it's slower to react to change in air temperature, and probably more reliable as a benchmark. So looking at grazing methodologies, I'm sorry, just going back to the autumn planting as well, try not to plant too late in the autumn. I know often taking arable crops off can push us late, but I think the later you go into September, the more risky generally it will become. It can be done, and we've had very successful later plantings, but the risk goes up significantly the further we go into the autumn season and beyond early September. So the grazing methodologies are really important here as well. Herbal leys are best maintained, and again, we're trying to maintain the diversity in the mixtures. They're best maintained by mob grazing. Those of you who have been looking at herbal leys for a while will have probably heard of mob grazing or cell grazing, very popular in yesteryear, and names like Savory and Newman Turner will ring in many people's minds, and really, really good examples of how to maintain a herbal ley well. Involves high stocking density for short periods of time and moving the animals on a regular basis. Now, these systems will change farm to farm, so the size of your paddock, the stocking density, the amount of time you leave the animals on any given cell. But it's one of these things that we learn and we warm to. It's one of these sort of anecdotal, you just know when the right time is to move your stock, and we can talk about that a little bit later in the Q's and A's. There is a little bit of investment to get, to sort of produce this system, to get a mob grazing system set up, but it's not overly complicated, and it should be relatively cheap. Some fencing, electric fencing, as we can see here, and also some water, so that we can make sure that the animals have access to a trough, in whichever cell they are in. Here we've got a little bit of an aerial view here of our own herbal ley. Here you can see, I think we've got about 80 ewes on each cell at a time, with young at feet, and we move them on a daily basis. So this is a herbal ley. It's a nice picture actually, because you can see the progression of the animals across the ley. You can see they would have started over more in the center of the image, where it's a much browner color, and moved towards the right, moving one cell at a time throughout the year. And we've even got some humans grazing on some herbal ley, which is great, just how palatable they are. But so yeah, this is our own example, and as Ian has said, please, if you'd like to come and see it, please do that. We'd love to see you and show you the herbal leys in flesh. So I've put this picture up really just to show that herbal leys are pretty applicable to lots of different purposes, and certainly dairy is one of them. Here we've got a dairy herd. This is actually by coincidence. This is Rob Richmond's dairy herd. And one of the reasons I like this photo is because it does show the height of the ley and the height of the ley, and our expectations of the visual aesthetic of these mixtures is really important as well. Herbal leys are taller, they have a higher canopy, and they are much, much longer when we send our animals in. So this is really, really important, because it's one of the most difficult factors to get your head around when it comes to managing these leys. The temptation is to send the animals in early, But what we don't want to do is we don't want to overgraze. We want to always make sure we're leaving some growth on these plants. Some of the plants are smaller and more fragile. So if we scalp the mixture down to the soil, we really run the risk of damaging or killing them off. So like I say, in order to try and maintain this diversity for as long as possible, we don't want to stress the plants. We don't want to stress them at all. We will last longer if we're not stressed. And that's what we're looking for in these lays as well. We're looking for that sort of Goldilocks zone where the majority of the canopy, the majority of the plants are at a fleshy, grazable stage. There will never be a time when all species are at the perfect stage ready to be grazed. That's part of the attraction of the Herbal Leys. Some species will be stronger in the spring, some species will be stronger in the autumn, and in different weather conditions as well. So it's an expectation that these lays are longer. When you send the animals in, that's okay. When we send our sheep in, you can't see them. That's very normal for us. And I think that the main thing is to not panic and have faith. These lays are designed to be a bit longer. It means that the plants are going to be less stressed, and you're going to maintain more ground cover, helping weed suppression, and there's always going to be plenty of forage. The recovery of a plant is a bit quicker when there's growth left on those plants. So this is another picture. Again, this is, I promise, by pure coincidence, this is Ian Boyd's farm. So this is his cattle herd. And it's just another look at a Herbal Ley. And the reason I put this picture up is that they do differ a lot. They differ quite significantly in their establishment and their visual appearance from farm to farm, from field to field. And when you vary your grazing methodologies as well. But they can be applicable to all sorts of different livestock. And some people say, "Oh, what a mess! What a lovely field of weeds we have here." But if you look a bit closer, you realise these are all sown species, and they're all things that we want in the ley to get all those lovely benefits that Ian was talking about earlier on. Now, this is another quite common question as well: is Herbal Leys. We're talking a lot about grazing. It's understandable that's a concern for those of us that don't have livestock. We appreciate that getting livestock on the farm, if we can, is a really beneficial thing to do. But if it's not possible, you can cut Herbal Leys. We have had various discussions with farmers looking at using it for AD, but also just straightforward for silaging. We have to tailor the mixtures ever so slightly, but we still keep the diversity of the species up. But they produce really good yields. And this is a picture of one of the farmers I've dealt with over the years, who's down in Cornwall, so on heavier land, produces really, really good yields for ensiling with Herbal Leys. You can see he's clamping it there. Here's some up close pictures of it in the field and in the clamp. The customer, one of the comments that he made about this particular clamp of silage was that it's quite similar to lucerne. It takes a little bit extra wilting, but it ensiles perfectly well, and is similar in texture to lucerne, so like a fleshy legume. And these mixtures are fleshier. They do tend to be a bit wetter, so they need to be wilted for a little bit longer, but they produce such fantastic quality forage. We've had numerous anecdotal comments of how forage has been put out into ring feeders, and where the stock have an option between Herbal Ley conserved forage and regular conserved forage from a regular grass ley, they always go to the Herbal Ley every time. It's very, very palatable, and you'll find the animals will make that decision for you. So I think that's it for me at the moment. There'll be lots of questions, I'm sure, in the Q&A a bit later on. But yeah, thanks ever so much for having us, and yeah, I'll pass over back to Ed now. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Paul. That was really helpful, and yeah, it's definitely stimulating conversation in the Q&A already. Quite a few questions coming through, which I can see Ian's kind of giving a live answer back to a lot of them, which is really helpful. A lot of people have been asking about how you might apply these to kind of horticultural systems, and I just wondered whether you could speak to how you might use them in a horticultural system. I think Jonty might touch on this later, but specifically thinking about the difference between a Herbal Ley in terms of just describing the species and using a green manure the difference there in terms of how you might distinguish between the two?
Interesting. Very interesting question. I mean, in some ways, there's not a huge deal of difference in the sense that we're trying to maintain the level of diversity. The more species we have growing in the ground, the more root structures we have, the more diverse biology we'll be supporting in the soil profile, the better the structure and the behavior of the soil will be. And that's ultimately what we're looking for. And obviously in the case of a herbal ley, it's nice because we potentially have this grazing potential where we're recycling nutrients. But when we're looking at more of a horticultural situation, I mean, we have a community supported agriculture area on our farm, and we have been using herbal leys as a soil improver for those areas, and it's done very, very well. I think a lot of it also comes down to preference. So a more diverse mixture can be trickier to manage, but if you keep an eye on it, it's absolutely possible. But some people prefer simpler approaches in the past, something maybe, typically fertility building mixtures, which include one grass and a couple of clovers. And that's great, but it's very, very simple. And so I think the key is that each individual situation is different. And I think if we have a general push to try and include as many species as possible, ones that suit your application and don't provide problems with volunteer weeds in subsequent crops and so on, which I believe Lydia is going to touch on later, then that's what we should be aiming at. But essentially, we're using similar species and tailoring them to the purpose. Whatever you do, make sure that you're getting grass seed mixtures and herbal ley mixtures which are appropriate to your purposes. I don't think it's sensible to rely on off-the-shelf options, which sometimes are a little bit too simplistic.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. And I think it's something that we're really hot on at FarmEd is in training about any of these essentially tools at the end of the day, or practices, is the kind of object we're looking at can be really exciting, but we need to always try and remember the context and the purpose of what we're trying to achieve and match it to that situation. So I'm really pleased that you mentioned that there. Great. Well, so we've gone through kind of how you set them up and how you might manage a ley, but a lot of people will be interested to understand what that looks like in the broader system of a rotation. And so Dr. Lydia Smith is going to share with us now some of the current research and very recent results that are coming out from her work in terms of the kind of after effects of a ley in a system, specifically to yields, but also volunteers. Hopefully that will answer some of these questions around weeds. Lydia, do you want to? Yep, you're all loaded up. Brilliant.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everybody. Really nice to be in this session. So what we wanted to look at was what happens next after the herbal ley. And I've been looking at these herbal leys for a few years on Innovation Farm, and I was very impressed with the way that they produced a huge biomass, as Ian talked about earlier on, and the complexity and all the other things that we haven't even talked about in that much detail, like resources for pollinators, and very importantly, soil benefits. So my question was precisely what happens, let's actually put some metrics on this, and in the arable East, is there potential for using these herbal leys in an arable system as a soil improver? So we rushed off and got some money from BBSRC and put together a multidisciplinary project to look at precisely what's happening. So what we decided to do was, first of all, look at what happens under different soil regimes. So this is a participatory project. We looked at sites right across the country. And in fact, we had one small extra benefit from COVID. Would you believe there is such a thing? But we got an extra site in Wales because our colleagues there were unable to come over and visit us during COVID lockdown. And we set up a site at those different places to see, okay, what happens? What happens if you graze it as compared to whether you mow it? How does it compare to a normal sort of standard grass clover ley? And how does that compare in terms of the types of tillage that you might use afterwards? So I didn't spend too long in the sort of preparation telling you how we set it up, but basically we set it up, as I said, grazed or mown, and we grew it for 2 years, and then we started to pull it back into an arable system. And this is kind of where we are now. So we've had that 2-year lay, and then we went back into wheat. So this is the actual site at Duxford in Cambridge. And I will concentrate on this mainly because I haven't really got time to cover all of the different sites, but I will touch on the others a little bit. So actually we swapped it around. So we put the mown part in the middle and the grazed. So here's the clover lay, either grazed or mown, and then we've got herbal lay, either mown or grazed. And we had the conventional tillage as a control. And there we are today. So we have all of these treatments now with the wheat overlaid on it. So what happened? Well, we went back into wheat, as I said, at the Duxford site. We looked at either direct drilling or plough and harrow. So we could have looked at a range of different tillages, but to be honest, we didn't have enough space and the numbers of replicates starts to get completely out of hand. So we thought we'd go for the two extremes. So in terms of establishment, we kind of expected this a little bit. We got a reduction at the direct drill for all treatments. So the green is the grass lay and the yellow is the herbal lay. So quite similar across them for the different treatments. And the blue over here is the arable control. Well, establishment's one thing, but what does that actually mean? Oh, sorry, this is the Loddington site, so a very similar picture there, slightly lower level of establishment right across the piece. But we then went on to have a look at heading rate, and as is often the case, we had a nice fill-in, if you like, of some of that slightly lower establishment that you would have hoped for. I've cut them differently here. So on the left, we have the herbal lay for all of the different treatments. So we've got grazed, mown, herbal lay, ploughed and mown. So these two are direct drilled. These two are ploughed and harrowed in preparation for the following crop. And then here we have the grass herbal lay. So the ones that I've starred are statistically basically the same. So we have pretty much the same outcome for our arable control and the ploughed grazed herbal lay and the direct drilled grazed herbal lay. Pretty much the same, you can't really put much between them. What did it look like? So here we have the wheat in full growth. This is quite a light soil. It's relatively deep for a chalk-based soil, which is what we have over there in Duxford. They're quite alkaline, coming in at about 7.5 and a relatively light, and it had been in continuous arable for many years. So it was quite a degraded soil in many ways. And you can see straight away that the amount of volunteers that we had coming back in the direct drill, there's the mown on the top and the graze beneath, and you can see the sandfoin coming through. And what you can't see quite so easily is there are other legumes below. So this was sprayed off and then direct drilled. So it didn't have heavy inputs. The centre one where my colleague Patrick McKenna is standing is direct drill the grass clover lay. And again, you can see there's clover down below. That's the arable on the left, the control and the grass lay on the right at the top. And finally, the grazed ploughed establishment. And you can see that's pretty clean. So what did we get in actual figures? I'm sure you want to know. Volunteer presence. So first of all, by quadrat this is. So the herbal lay volunteers in the following wheat. Very clear difference we've found between the mown, which is this orange line, and the grazed, which is this blue line at the front. So there you can see the sandfoin. You could already see it in the pictures coming back, but much more in the mown than the grazed. And this is not surprising really, because the stock were taking out the sandfoin. They love it. They similarly are very keen on the chicory. So these were the two dominant volunteers, if you want, that were coming back afterwards, but much more so in the mown. And then at the back here, we've got the grass ploughed and the mown ploughed. So very, very low numbers of volunteers in the ploughed and harrowed treatment at the back there. Just to see what happened in the grass clover lay, obviously there are far fewer species. Same picture though, here, the red line is the mown, and here at the front, the blue line is the grazed. So a small number of clover plants coming through, and then these other species, red clover, which I guess must have escaped actually because it wasn't in the original mixture, bit of cocksfoot and ryegrass, which was the main component of that grass clover ley. And the only weed, so we talked about weeds coming through, the only weed that we found in any of the plots was false parsley, which appeared a little bit in the grass clover ley. Okay, just jumping out of Herbal Leys for a moment, what are the other benefits? There's a lot of rhetoric at the moment over net zero. My goodness, there should be. And there's a lot of consideration about how much carbon is coming as a result of the way that we farm our fields. So we need to get emissions down. We've got ambitious climate change targets. You know, by 35, the government is looking for some big changes, and the Intergovernmental Panel states really need doing something big time. So net zero, a net carbon dioxide is the same as what we put in is what we take out. We need to do lots of things in ways of doing that. Absolute zero, stop emitting it for any particular activity. That's probably quite tricky in most instances. Avoidance, doing things like not using coal or gas. And let's remember that nitrogen is produced by the Haber-Bosch process primarily. And of course, taking carbon out of the atmosphere and locking it up. So lots of things potentially we can do with these Herbal Leys in terms of achieving these kind of things. And let's not forget the last one, greenhouse gases. One of the other main components that are the nitrogen oxide gases and methane, as well as halides. So in terms of the amount coming from agriculture, around about 10% in the UK, and of that, the amount, a stonking great amount, is in the fertilizer application. Okay, you might say, oh, we know all this, but I just wanted to remind ourselves. Also, carbon dioxide is the main component that is causing this warming, but nitrous oxide, which is what we will get from use of fertilizers that are incompletely used, has a much higher impact than carbon dioxide itself. Right, so the results. And they are so wonderful. I mean, you hope when you're going to do something like this that you will get what you hope for, but we really did. So here is the control, the arable control. Here on the right is the ploughed and harrowed treatment, and here in the middle is the direct drill treatment. So we've got the yield, grain yield of the wheat in that first wheat following the treatments. We knew we were going to get a reduction in yield from the direct drill because we had those volunteers and because we had a slightly reduced establishment. And even though that heading rate made up a little bit, so we have a reduction. But if we look at the plough and the harrow, where we have very good control of volunteers, you actually even have a very similar, indistinguishably small difference between the Herbal Ley grazed, as I said, which was the choice of the two, compared to the arable control. And in terms of the grass clover, that was actually quite close behind, but it didn't reach the heights that the Herbal Ley did. Quality, well, you want to ask is, are we still getting the same quality? So grain protein percentage, just taking one of those qualitative parameters that we want to be sure about. Again, we are getting not just as good as, but better than the arable control. So you can see some of these figures are actually coming out as better quality than the control. Now, one of the things I want to stress, and if you've been reading the small print up at the top here, in the arable control, we gave it the full normal inputs, which is 220 kilograms of nitrogen. In the other two treatments, the Herbal Ley and in the grass clover ley, we halved that. So we're getting these kind of results, and I'll just remind you what we got from the yield. We're getting these results with half the nitrogen treatment. I thought that was a brilliant result and better than I was anticipating. I know I'm going to run out of time, but I just wanted to stress again some of the other wonderful things that we are getting from these complex mixtures. So I picked out 4 of them. We've got sandfoin on the left, chicory, plantain, and bird's foot trefoil all sorts of benefits when you're using these as a grazing. And of course, if you're mowing it, probabilities that you're selling this on to a livestock producer. So we've got things like reduction of nitrogen in the urine compared to the feces. We've got it acting as a diuretic and affecting the way that the animals use mineral nutrients. We've got nitrification inhibitors going through in the urine. We've got reduction in gastrointestinal parasites and reduction in nematode infestations in the livestock animals, and reduction in rumen escape, so the better use of that nitrogen going into the animals. So back to those volunteers again, is that really a bad thing, bearing in mind that reduction in nitrogen that we have? Sorry, I didn't mean to go quite so quickly. This is the mown area, but this is the grazed area. So we're getting sandpoint. I found it pretty wonderful to be in a high yielding, good quality field of wheat with resources for pollinators right through the season. And I know some people say we should keep the biodiversity out of the farmed environment. I don't know. I found this quite a lovely site. And as you see, we had sandfoin in the earlier part of the year, and then just before harvest, we started to get a bit of chicory flowering too. Here's my team. It's a big team. There's lots of other work going on. We've barely skimmed the surface of the results that are coming out of this project. So we've got 2 postgraduate students and a postdoc, and we've got staff from the University of Sheffield, Harriet Watt, Rothamsted, NIAB, of course, and Bangor, and CEH. And you'll probably see other results in other events going forward. And special thanks to Patrick, my postdoc, and others at NIAB, without whom I couldn't possibly do this sort of work. So I hope that I've left lots of time for questioning. I'm going to stop sharing the screen.
Thanks very much, Lydia. Yeah, perfect timing on that. Amazing to see, particularly for me, the how the leys kind of influence, or the species in the leys can influence an animal's metabolism, and then actually, you know, how interconnected that whole process is. I got a couple of questions just to ask quickly. One was around the kind of question of diversity, because I think sometimes people will think of a herbal ley as long as it's got a grass, a legume, a herb, it's doing the job. In order to achieve results similar to yours, is there kind of a consensus on a minimum amount of diversity, or can you speak to the diversity that you were using?
This project, as I said, it was funded by the BBSRC, but we wanted it to be participatory. So we involved a number of farmers in the process, and Cotswold Seeds volunteered to advise the project. So we decided to use the most complex herbal ley that they produce, but there are lots of others that produce herbal leys, and many of those are slightly less diverse in terms of their complexity. What I would say is that there is an absolute perfect ideal, and not least, you know, you'll get slightly different species will do better under different circumstances. So I've grown these. I've grown the Cotswold Seeds herbal ley, and indeed several others produced by their competitors, if you like, in many different places, and they just look different depending on the season, depending on the soil, depending on the climate. And I think that having a little bit more complexity than maybe is absolutely necessary is a good thing, because some years, some of those species just won't do so well. And if you've already got quite an abbreviated set of species, if you lose one of the 2 legumes, then actually you're losing some of that quality. So I think some of the more diverse herbal leys, in my opinion, and in my experience, work better. But in terms of the actual species, I'm actually not going to say that we know enough yet about what is the absolute perfect one, because there isn't one. You know, you've got different types of situations. I would say that some of the very deep rooting legumes are good. So the sandfoil works incredibly well in dry, arid, light soils, like we quite often have in the east, especially we've got lower rainfall as well, and in an alkaline soil. And we use the Cotswold Seed 4-year herbal ley on the Welsh site. We didn't actually expect the sandfoin to do too well because it's a bit borderline. It's kind of a 6.5 to 7, which is borderline for some of the more alkaline loving species, but actually it did really well. And the other thing is that on a very heavy site, some of the leguminous species can struggle a bit. But again, we put this on the Star site at Suffolk, and it did very well. It depends a bit. We had a nice dry period before establishment. Sorry, it's a bit of a long answer, but it's not an easy.
No, it's great. I mean, it just comes back to this point. Context is everything. Making sure you're using the right species, as Paul was saying earlier, which is great. So we've heard from someone demonstrating Herbal Leys, heard from someone advising and selling Herbal Leys, heard from someone researching Herbal Leys. We're now going to hear from Jonty as a farmer, kind of doing his best to use these Herbal Leys in a real farm. And really looking forward to hearing all the different ways that you're using them, Jonty.
Welcome, everyone. Lovely to see you all. Just looking through the participants, got some friends, old and new, and PFLA farmers, and some new herbalists in the list, which is great to see. I'm Jonty. I farm at Connigree Farm in the Cotswolds, Sherborne Park Estate, and National Trust tenant. Been here 15 years. Our passion, as Ed said, it's all about context. My passion is all about restoring soil, habitat, working with our local community, producing local food. So agroecological, regenerative, pastured, organic farmers, basically. 73 hectares. We want to see diversity across the farm, whether it's trees, whether it's wildflowers, natives, or things like borage or Herbal Leys. And one of my mantras has been low input or no input, and not low output, but premium output. And that's the key to make a living, to make a profit. Diversity always. We run a diverse set of enterprises, from traditional Hereford cattle, rare breed Cotswold sheep. They are rare for a reason. Old spot pigs. We've got a market garden, all sorts of other things. We've got a livery. We've got beehives on site. They're joint ventures. Probably the best farming decision we did make was actually the market garden, the 3-acre joint venture with a young grower. And I'll come on to that a little bit more at the end. I know there's some good questions around Herbal Leys and horticulture. It's called Cotswold Market Garden, if you want to Google it. And we sell everything locally. Everything goes through the farm gate, from the farm door, from a pop-up shop or a local box scheme. We also love sharing the farm with others. We do glamping, we've got wedding business on site, education stuff. We've been doing quite a bit over the last 15 years, and we're growing this side right now. And this is important. We'll come back to this again shortly. Our soils, like at Farm Ed, most of our soils are very, very thin Cotswold, brash, limestone. You can see there, that's not the worst field, by the way. It's a challenging soil, but also very forgiving in a way. We can treat it quite hard. We can graze it through the winter. Our cattle's feet do not sink into that, but it is very droughty. So it poses a different set of challenges. We're also at about 300 meters above sea level, and it is exposed. So it is a cold farm. So we're always 2 or 3 weeks behind everybody else at April, May drilling time. Where do Herbal Leys fit into our system? We usually each year got around 12 hectares of the farm into Herbal Leys in some sort of rotation. We also mix that with wild bird covers or bumblebird mixes as well, about 6 hectares every year, and arable margins. About 8 hectares of the farm is permanent pasture improved. The majority of the farm is my passion, 40 hectares of permanent pasture, unimproved species rich stewardship type stuff, trying to revert it to native local provenance species rich pasture. The market garden there, and we just planted lots and lots more trees. About 10% of the farm is now trees. The mix I use, I've been working with Cotswold Seeds for about 8 years now, 9 years. We're now organic, so we have to use the organic mix, which is about 15 species, and you can see there. So you've got the cocksfoot, the ryegrass, Timothy fescues, red clover, alsike, sweet clover, sandfoin, white clover, and bird's foot trefoil, the chicory, which we love, and then ribgrass, bonnet, and yarrow. That's the mix that we put in every 4 or 5 years. Establishment, Paul's talked about establishment. It's not easy. There are lots and lots of ways of doing this. And I think, speaking to some of the questions too, it depends on your objectives, your soil type, the season, the kit you have available, the contractors you have available, the time you have, the weather, and crikey, every season seems so different. I would normally say spring, go for it in the spring. But every time I drill in the spring, it doesn't rain for 2 months. Just done an autumn drill. I think I went 2 weeks a little bit too late. It's looking okay, but not as good as it could be. And that was due to contractor availability. So I'm going to tell you whether to do spring or autumn. Go with the soil temperature for sure, but different ways of doing it. We have created that perfect, nice, fine seed bed and rolled. Picture on the right. We have direct drilled into a very tired lay on the left. Both have worked, but both are very different. You'll get different establishment, different successors, but that's okay. That's the key to having a diverse lay. Some things will work brilliantly, not everything will work every year perfectly. Another thing that we've tried, and I don't know if this has been mentioned, undersowing. We're in stewardship. We've got wild bird covers, bumblebird mixers going in spring or autumn. I hate losing 6 to 12 months of grazing when we come out of those wild bird covers or the bumblebird mixers and then going in with Herbal Leys. So we have been undersowing our wild bird covers with Herbal Ley, and that acts as a great pollinator resource for that year. So it works for bumblebird mixers. The cereals finish, the birds have the grain, and you're left with a grazing crop, hopefully underneath. The clovers are there, the grass is there, the chicory is there, the sainfoin's there, the ribgrass is there. Not everything is bang on, it's tricky, but at least you haven't lost 6 months, 12 months of quality grazing, straight into grazing when the birds have had the seed. Grazing quandaries, again, we're all doing it different, and that's okay. We've all got different objectives and different ways of doing stuff. I mob graze when I can. So on the left, I turn my cows into Herbal Leys that are 6 foot tall, above the cow's head sometime. That's fine. Sheep can go into that at any point. I don't worry about pink eye. They don't get stabbed between the feet. We don't get bloat. We don't get fertility problems. We can turn the cows or the sheep into those tall Herbal Leys. They love it. They'll take the chicory tips, the sainfoin, and then slowly squash a bit into the ground for me and slowly work it down. On the right, probably overgrazed, but that's a flirt, utilising the cattle and the sheep together, not moving every day, more rotational grazing at this point, moving from field to field, maybe every week. I'm too busy to fence every day and move. Hay and silage, there was a question from David earlier. We've taken silage before. If you leave it too late, it's stalky. But I have had a local dairy farmer put it straight into a clamp and he was happy with it. But if you're baling it, take it early. Take that first cut before the chicory gets too stalky. It is a good conserved crop. We love them. It's diverse. The proteins are good, 14 to 19%, depending on what you're monitoring, measuring, and when. MEs of around 12, and of course, full of the nutrients that Ian and Lydia have mentioned, and the tannins for worming. Higher yields and output than our permanent pastures, our permanent stewardship pastures, not necessarily high intensity of lots of nitrogen ryegrass pastures. No bloat, no fertility. A wonderful grazing in the summer, as we know. And in the winter, I use them for deferred grazing, for either tall grass grazing, a bit of a wedge going into November, December, maybe into January, but I also use them for bale grazing. By year 4 and 5, if that cocksfoot has got that nice bit of thatch and that bit of structure underneath, they're wonderful for rolling bales out on and using as that bale grazing area. And it's okay. I'm not going to say the word poaching, it's soil massaging. And maybe it's a great entry into your next crop or next bit of the rotation after bale grazing. There's an example, that's mid-February, March, it's cold, but the cocksfoot underfoot is holding it all up, and we roll the bales out onto the Herbal Leys, incorporating some seed from those bales back in. So if you want your Herbal Leys to last another few years, maybe that's not a bad way of doing it. Resilience, when it doesn't rain, crikey in the Cotswolds, when it doesn't rain, we are droughty. So things like the bird's foot trefoil, the only green things in our landscape. So that's really crucial. Soil benefits. We are seeing the growth of soil organic matter and depth of soil. We're getting to organic matters of 6, 7, 8, 10% on our Herbal Leys, which are 2 or 3% higher than the arable fields on the farm. And of course, we're getting free nitrogen. That's crucial. Wildlife, we want the farmland birds. If we leave it tall, we're not topping everything, we're leaving stuff to look messy. And that's a key mindset. It's going to look messy if you do it well. And that's, a lot of us, a lot of farmers struggle to get over that bit, but leave the seed and the structure there for wildlife, and particularly for birds and the inverts. The honeybees love it, particularly the sandfoin. The best honey you'll get, sandfoin honey. And you get some dense cover and some thatch and tussocks, but you get open ground as well, which is brilliant for wildlife. And of course, that fits well with stewardship, either OP4 or GS4. Leave it to flower. Doesn't have to be the whole farm or all your Herbal Leys at once. You can rotate and move it round. As long as something's flowering in the summer, it works really well. We've not talked really about the nutritional benefits to our meat. We need to sell direct, add value. We're pasture for life farmers. We want those higher omega-3s. So it's crucial we've got those legumes in our diet. And the research there has shown that. One or two, just to finish really, one or two other little benefits. We've planted lots of trees this year. The Herbal Leys have been a brilliant entry for tree planting. They're not too grassy and vigorous, so they don't smother the trees, but they have built that fungal bacterial balance for planting the trees straight into. So that's good, and the soil structure. The market garden, which mentioned earlier, we put our market garden into a Herbal Ley. And the beneficial insects for the bits that we haven't cultivated yet or put into beds, the wild carrot, for example, and the stuff that jumps out of the chicory when there's an attack in the polytunnels is amazing. We're not using it as a fertility build. Well, we did it in year 1, but we're now using things like rye and vetch as our fertility builds in our rotation, not Herbal Leys. And just really to finish, tourism value. Mention I like people on the farm. They look beautiful. So when you're doing glamping and teepees and stuff, it's another great sort of added value. And it's more colourful in a way sometimes, a more traditional meadow, and a bit bigger, and people love it. They don't know it's not a traditional meadow. Forage cost, really. Seed, 207 quid a hectare for me in year 1. No fert. Got the establishment costs with a contractor, no other costs. So it costs us about £362 to get that Herbal Ley into the ground. Divide it by 5 years, it's going to last 5 years, about £72 a year cost of having that Herbal Ley. But we're in stewardship, OP4 in this instance, £115 per year. So we're being paid about £43 per year to graze. If we're conventional, it'd be £244. Don't ask me why GS4 payments are better than organic payments. So we're being paid. It's a win, 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 I think. Problems, establishment, it can be tricky, can be slow to start. Talked about that. Treat them carefully. Easy to overgraze, particularly in the winter. Undersowing can work, but won't always be perfect. Chicory can be vigorous, particularly in the next crop, can look messy, mindset, crucial, not suitable for semi-improved native grassland sites. This is an arable crop, not on your species-rich meadows or your lovely semi-improved pastures. They need protecting. Might work in improved pastures, but not semi-improved. And of course, the grassland rules, 5 or 7 years come into play, possibly. That will change. And just to finish, SFI, we can talk about this in the chat really. There's Herbal Leys all the way through SFI, through the arable and horticultural soil standard, the grassland standards, and it will be in the arable standards for sure. Basically, we don't know a lot. More might be announced today or tomorrow at the other conference, but by using Leys, maybe £28 per hectare, £58 per hectare, if 15% of your land is in the standard, that's the grassland soils, improved grassland soils. And it's in there, potentially in the arable standard too. Use it as a cover crop. or to build soil, and you'll be paid for it. I will stop there because there's more to come on SFI. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jonty. And yeah, I was going to ask you a question on SFI, but you've covered that there at the end, which is great. So I'm going to open it to the floor just because we've got about 19 minutes left in this session. I want to make sure we can cover all the questions that have been coming in. We have been getting lots of live answers going, so hopefully your questions have been answered, but I might kind of highlight a few of those just for the benefit of everyone. I think there's been some really good questions there. Just to get us started, and I'll open this up to everyone. Lydia, you got your hand up. Do you want to...
Yeah, there's a couple that I thought I would answer live rather than just typing it in. Tony Chapman wanted whether we would go on for longer. Yes, I didn't stress that enough, that yes, we are going on for longer because we wanted to have a look what would happen after another year's worth of ley. And we were going to discontinue this experiment at the end of the project, but I've managed to twist a few arms. So we're going to hang on to our just a small portion of the herbal ley so we can maybe look at some of these many other questions that have arisen as a result of the work. So we'll definitely get another year and maybe longer. That was one question. The other one was, he asked about soil losses. And this is a really interesting one, the reduction potential in erosion, the soil that's become degraded and reduced in organic matter. And we did get clear improvement in organic matter, soil organic carbon, I should be specific here, even after a couple of years late. So we are looking into that, but again, not enough detail yet. So always looking for more funding. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Lydia. And just on that first one, the question I was going to ask to everyone, their opinion on this, is this idea of the length of time that a ley needs to go in. Is it enough to put it in for 1 year? Is 1 year better than no years? Or do we need to be aiming for that 3, 4, 5 years? Paul, maybe I'll come to you first if you've got some thoughts on that.
You beat me to it. So yeah, I think really and truly, these plants need to be in the ground for at least a sort of a bare minimum period of time if they're going to have a significant effect. There's absolutely a lot of work being done and a lot of merit in shorter term cover crops, and certainly diverse cover crops, effectively herbal cover crops are really important too. Glyn Mitchell brought up the subject of soil succession, and it's about building the soil, and it's an evolution very much. So it's a case of developing these roots and developing biology, which can take time. Large roots, big significant root structures, mycorrhizal fungi and all these things can take time to develop. You can't achieve that or at least you can achieve much better results by having those multiple species, multiple root structures in the ground, I would say for at least a couple of years. Herbal leys, we would say you're going to start to see the biggest benefit after sort of 3 or 4 years. And obviously beyond that point, all the better. But having a herbal ley in the ground for just a year would probably be a bit questionable. The species that are included are slightly longer term perennial species generally. There are some shorter term species in there as well, but they tend to be longer term perennials. So for that reason, they take a little bit longer to get going. For short term benefit, and certainly the soil succession, which Glyn was alluding to, you can absolutely achieve some really good inroads in short term diverse cover crops and really building and building momentum on soil succession, building that biology, building that diversity in the soil profile at all various levels.
Does anyone else want to add on to that question of timing? Or Ian, do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, just echo the points that have already been made really, but I think what you need to think about is the whole system. It's not about one aspect of it, whether you may get slightly more wheat yield. We're looking for resilient systems. We're looking to rebuild soils. Remember, a lot of these leys are going into arable situations, as Jonty described. And I think, if we're after long-term improvements, that will suppress blackgrass and all the other practical problems that face most arable farms. We need to do it properly, and properly is not a year. You know, of course there's an effect. It's useful, as Paul alluded to. You know, its effect, there's some effect, but the effects really stack up for longer when they're in the ground longer. And I'm sure, Lydia, when this work's done, your work, I think you'll, well, I'm hoping that, as you've demonstrated already, that the anecdotal evidence will be confirmed by the science, which you're particularly good at. So yeah, I look forward to that, but I'll stop there.
Great, thank you. So yeah, there's definitely this broad space we're speaking about here, where we would be considering cover crops, leys, green manures, and I think there's certainly some overlap in the knowledge being used there. Another way I've found, and it's come up in a couple of questions again, that people apply the idea of herbal leys is they're considering it as a kind of overseeding or reseeding for permanent pasture. And herbal leys being construed as this idea of just diversifying something. I wonder if I'll come to Jonty actually on this question to start with, what your view is in terms of using a herbal ley mix into a existing permanent pasture.
Yeah, works well in improved pasture. You've got that nutrient soaked in the improved pasture anyway. You can stitch it in. You'll get, I mean, Paul probably tell me better, you get some good establishments, not perfect, but I wouldn't put it into a semi-improved, as I said. That is a species-rich resource that we should leave alone.
Yeah, great.
And that's the way the government's looking at it in SFI. There's going to be some quite strict rules, I think. I've already noted some people putting herbal leys into semi-improved pastures, and it's not good.
There's perhaps this distinction here of a herbal ley being the way in which we're using these species, and there are other ways of using diversifying species and things, but just kind of boxing herbal leys as a particular practice which uses these species. Lydia, you've got your hand up. Do you want to come in on that question?
Yeah, so one of our collaborating farmers did a version of this for our project. They had put in what would have been a not very diverse herbal ley as part of another sort of scheme, and they wanted to join the project. So they augmented what they had with a number of extra species. I wouldn't say it was very successful. They didn't really get all that much establishment of the additional species. And I guess with the beauty of hindsight, it would probably have been better to really just redo the planting, because, you know, they don't cost an absolute fortune, these augmented sort of species mixtures, but, you know, I just didn't think that they got a good return. So I think on balance, this seems to be the kind of what farmers are telling me, that it's probably best to decide to do it and do it properly from the start. And that seedbed, all that information that Paul gave you in the establishment, I think getting them established properly and well at the beginning makes all the difference. That's my view.
Brilliant, thank you. Paul, do you mind if we jump onto another question, or have you got a burning thing you'd like to share there?
I've got a burning thing I would like to share with you, if that's okay.
Burn away.
It's just this business. I just want people to understand how we might vary a mixture if we're looking at overseeding. Very early days when we were first doing herbal ley mixtures, some customers were taking the all singing, all dancing herbal ley with all the grasses, all the legumes, all the herbs, and trying to introduce that into existing grass without speaking with us first. So we didn't know this was happening. And what we were finding was that the full mixture being introduced into existing grass, first of all, the existing grass wasn't being knocked back anywhere near enough in order to allow space for lots of these more fragile species to get going. Secondly, the type of grass that it was being sown into, in some cases, was an aggressive ryegrass ley. So again, more vigor from the existing grass. But I think also very, very importantly, when we put herbal overseeding mixtures together, we tend not to include much grass, or if any at all, because the assumption is that you've already got some existing grass. We have to be careful not to overdo it, and we want to try and focus on establishing the more difficult species, and the more expensive species, which are the herbs and the legumes. These are the bits that we really need to make sure work, because these are the powerhouse of these mixtures. So it's really focusing on those species. The grasses are a little bit easier to overseed, perhaps at a later date, and there's probably a reasonable diversity of grasses already there. So the mixtures for overseeding are different. That's my little strap line there.
Great, thank you. One of the questions I want to come to, it looks like Ian has been typing an answer for a while on the question. I'm not sure if the answer's gone through yet, but Mike had a question around the use of livestock to terminate lays. So we've discussed the kind of trade-offs of, you might use a plough, you might use glyphosate. Can anyone speak to the use of livestock as a way of terminating? And I'll mix into that another question that came up. I think Jonty, you've already answered, but if you're overwintering stock, particularly cattle on the herbal ley, are there any benefits to that in terms of it knocking out species and vice versa? If it's earlier on in the year, in the delay, why you wouldn't want to overwinter? Come to Jonty first, actually.
Yeah, thanks. I've not seen anyone terminating herbal leys with livestock, particularly in horticulture. I think it's worth trying at a small scale, put the pigs through, and you then can hand hoe and get rid of the chicory by hand. It might work at small scale. On Kevin's question around species carrying over through the winter after bale grazing, yeah, the leys take a bit of a hit with that winter grazing. It is overgrazing at the end of the day, but it's also what I call the soil massaging. But what I have found is that you think the chicory's disappeared. Maybe that first spring, it's disappeared and it's not looking great. The second year, it's turned into 6 chicory plants, and you actually get more chicory by year 2 or 3. It will change every year, and that's the beauty of it. Just when you think you've lost everything, it's still there.
Thanks. Just one farm I recently visited, Paddock Farm, just north of us in Oxfordshire. I believe it's using pigs to terminate their herbal ley. And it's pretty effective, but it does end up with a real kind of mud pit of a field afterwards. So it needs to be integrated into the system. I've got 3 hands up on this, so just rapid answers, just so we can make time for the last one. Come to Paul next. Oh, you've muted yourself.
Yeah, sorry, I put my hand down, so I didn't want to mix up. But basically, just we have had some situations where we've had pigs that have terminated crops, but like exactly as Jonty said, it's only really practical on a small scale and only in a very niche system. So yeah, I'll move on.
Lydia?
Well, I already talked about the difference between mowing and grazing in terms of that control going through to arable. I've had quite a few farmers say to me that having a heavy graze of cows as opposed to sheep does knock the chicory back quite hard, if that's one of the things that's concerned. One thing I didn't mention, I guess, was that we sprayed off, obviously, on the Duxford site with glyphosate. But we did that literally one pass, and we could have got, not only used for the organic guys, but we could have got better control. And my technician said, do you want us to control that volunteer chicory and sandfoil? And I said, no, leave it. Let's see how we get on with a very low input system.
Great. And Ian, I'm not sure if this is what you're going to mention, but maybe just talking to how we've really grazed the leys hard for chicory. Is that this year? Put your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. And there's 2 or 3 points I wanted to make. Might include that one if I may. Very quickly, in answer to a couple of questions that we may have missed. Harriet, thank you for your question. It's a really good one about species or plant families. Well, they are, obviously there's a subtle difference. So the true clovers, for example, are one plant family that we might think of. But it's important to have really distinct plants. So it's no good having loads and loads of the same thing, lots of grasses, lots of clovers. What we're looking for is lots of different plants that express themselves completely differently, i.e. really deep roots, early spring growth or late season growth. That when you get those big differences expressed between different species and different plant families, you get the most over yielding effect. And that's got to be the #1 driver for these leys. Very quick point, I know we're running out of time, I'll be really brief. So a question around destruction of leys without ploughing. Sorry, establishment of leys without ploughing. you do need a fine seed bed. You know, one way or another, as Lydia's slide showed us, the work that she's done showed very clearly that the best results were coming from good establishment with a seed bed. I think I'm probably reading between the lines slightly, but I think if Lydia will allow me to say that. Absolutely critically important. We've tried putting in, for example, Herbal Leys underneath our birdseed mixtures. We have a wild bird seed mixtures, and we've tried establishing. Of course, inevitably what happens is you get a relatively thin Herbal Ley that hasn't got the populations of plants that you might want. So and it's in the ground for 4 years. So for 4 years, we've got a substandard ley. It's not good enough. We need to have excellent establishment, and perfect establishment is the way to go. Without ploughing though, quickly to Richard Gantlett, many of you will know him. He has been developing his system in Wiltshire around the use of cultivation, surface cultivation, rather than deep ploughing. And as many as we're doing, we're trying to minimize the heavy cultivations, of course, but there are many people trying different methods of establishment and destruction. And destruction, you know, with the plough or with Richard's method of heavy cultivators, not dissimilar to Newman Turner, by the way, he used a set of discs. It depends on your soil. It's all about context. So it depends what you are. But I think this shallow surface cultivation for most people in low input systems or organic systems will be worth a look at.
Great. Thank you, Ian. Okay, we have 2 minutes left. So rapid last points from Lydia. Paul's put his hand down, but Lydia, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, so I totally agree with what Ian just said. We actually tried to establish a ley without rolling Innovation Farm 1 year. I can't remember what the reasons were, and it just didn't establish anywhere near as well as doing it as Paul had outlined. And I'd say that once you do get it established, what we haven't talked about is regeneration. So within the site at Duxford, there was a lot of, it wasn't a broken ley by any means, but there was lots of recruitment of extra plants into the thing once the whole thing had established well. So, you know, you establish it well and it gets better and better as well.
Brilliant, thank you. Great, well, we're coming to the end of the session. I really enjoyed this, and it's been great listening to each of you speak. Just a few things that popped up in the chat I think really worth mentioning. I saw Dan Isles from Innovative Farmers at the Soil Association. They're currently putting together some work on running kind of farmer-led field trials on Herbal Leys, so definitely check that out. The conversation on this session is going to continue in the Hoover or Hoover, however you pronounce the platform we're using. So if you want to continue the conversation there, please do go ahead. And at FarmEd, we're running 2 workshops this year on establishing and managing Herbal Leys. So if you didn't get enough from this hour and a half, we have full day sessions on the 8th of March and 14th of June, where we'll go through some of the practical advice and considerations for how to do this properly. I think my key takeaway from this, if I can share it, is that context is everything. We can get really excited about something like a Herbal Ley as being an off-the-shelf solution, but really we have to fit it to the right purpose and the right context. So I hope you've all enjoyed this. We look forward to seeing you at FarmEd and to continue this discussion wherever that might take place. Thank you all.